I'm Alex Wellerstein. I'm a nuclear historian. I'm here today to answer your questions from the internet. This is Nuclear History Support. All right, first up, we have one from @American_Gov. What countries have nukes? There are 9 countries today in the world with nuclear weapons that we know about. The United States, first country that got them. The Soviet Union got them in 1949. Today, those nuclear weapons are in the hands of the Russian Federation. The United Kingdom, People's Republic of China, France. These are the 5 officially allowed countries under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to have nuclear weapons. There is also Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. So 9 countries total. There were a few countries that inherited nuclear weapons after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, but they returned all of those weapons to Russia in an agreement. LJ Whitman 1 asks, who decides which countries can have nukes and which countries can't? What are their criteria? The decision about who can, quote unquote, have nukes and who, quote unquote, can't, this is the result of a treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was created in 1968 to try and slow the spread of nuclear weapons. If you sign the treaty, you agree that only 5 countries, the countries that had tested nuclear weapons by 1967, are allowed to have nuclear weapons. Anybody else is not allowed under that treaty. So if you sign that treaty, you agree those are the only 5 that have nuclear weapons and nobody else should have. Pakistan, India, and Israel never signed the treaty, have developed their own nuclear weapons. There's also North Korea, which was a member of the treaty, but then left the treaty and made nuclear weapons. Is it illegal for them to have nuclear weapons? Only in the sense that they're not members of the treaty. What the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty does is it allows any country without nuclear weapons to know that anybody else who signed the treaty is probably not also trying to get nuclear weapons. So if you're worried that your rival across the way might be getting nukes, if you and they both sign the treaty, then you're not going to have to worry as much about them getting the weapons. It also gives them access to peaceful nuclear technology like nuclear reactors. It means that they have the right to work on that kind of stuff without worrying that somebody's going to try and blow up their reactor out of fear that it's a nuclear bomb. Zip Thwang asks, was Iran building a bomb? If so, how close to a bomb was Iran? How were the nuclear talks going before Israel preemptively attacked? Great question. Was Iran building a nuclear weapon? No, I don't think anybody thinks Iran was actively building a nuclear weapon. The accusation made particularly by Israel is that Iran was setting up the conditions under which it could build a nuclear weapon very quickly if it wanted to. Iran did have a nuclear weapons program before 2003, and the Iran deal was them essentially saying, we're going to close down and disable all the little things we were doing that were bad, and we won't do them anymore. Once the United States left the Iran deal, Iran has been creeping up beyond the limits of the deal. Depending on what your stance is, you either think that's because they are trying to get ready to make a bomb, or because they're trying to compel the United States to come back to the negotiation table as a way of saying, look, if you leave this deal, which we did, we can do this now, and if you want us to stop, come back to the deal. Now, how are the nuclear talks going? I don't think that great. I don't think it's clear exactly what Iran wants per se. They're sort of leaving the door open for different options, which would make a lot of sense given the recent history that they've had with the United States and with Israel. But they were not, racing to make a bomb. Hell Here Kitten asks, WTF is a nuclear football? It's basically a suitcase. What the nuclear football is meant to do is allow the President of the United States to order a nuclear strike, even if they are not in the White House or the Pentagon. If the president is visiting some other country or some other city, they have basically a very burly, usually military person carrying a very heavy suitcase around. And in that suitcase, there are information about nuclear war plans. There are some communication tools probably to allow the president to easily link up with top generals and advisors and whatever is needed to authenticate the president's nuclear war order if the president decides to make that. Sophie Kekelson asks, once in a while, I think about how many nukes the US has lost. How TF do you lose a nuke? Find them now. There are a number of quote unquote lost nuclear weapons. And what that really means is there is a nuclear weapon that was on, say, an airplane or a submarine, and that airplane either crashed or the submarine sunk, and the weapon is now in the environment in the world. These kinds of accidents were not super uncommon during the Cold War. The United States had a program in the 1950s and 1960s to basically have airplanes with nuclear weapons flying in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so that if nuclear war started, they could have some kind of guarantee that they'd have a plane ready to retaliate no matter what. Same thing with submarines. They still go around with nuclear weapons on them all the time. If you have thousands of airplanes flying tens of thousands of flight hours, you're going to have an accident every once in a while. Some of these accidents have resulted in like the weapon either itself falling out of the plane, or in the case of a submarine, just going down to the bottom of the ocean. Any kind of mishap you can imagine, a lot of them have happened. In most cases, of course, the United States is very interested in recovering those weapons, both because it's not a good look to have lost nuclear weapons, but also they contain the fuel you might need to make more nuclear weapons, and you don't want that falling in the wrong hands. And so the U.S. always tried to recover these things, but sometimes the warhead sunk so deep underground that after weeks of trying to dig it out, they couldn't get it, or it's at the bottom of the ocean and they couldn't find it. They're lost in the sense that the U.S. can't recover them, not that they don't know more or less where they're and they're lost in the sense that the U.S. couldn't recover them and thinks nobody else could either, and decided to sort of cut their losses. And, maybe they put a monument that says, don't dig here. But they concluded that if the Army couldn't dig this thing up, nobody else could either. Matilda Mother 67 asks, why did the United States bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki instead of some military headquarters or other places where civilians weren't? There were a lot of processes and meetings and decisions made along the way about what this bomb was, how it should work, what it would be used against. At the beginning of making the bomb, like say 1943, the attitude was, we'll probably use this against some sort of military installation. The first target they even discussed was basically the Japanese equivalent of Pearl Harbor. It's called Truk. And sure, there would be some civilians there, but it's not dropping it in the middle of a city. By 1945, 2 years later, one, Truk is not an issue militarily anymore. They had cut it off. It was not a target. And two, the United States had gotten in the habit of targeting cities. In the early part of 1945, the United States began firebombing Japanese cities with napalm. They burnt Tokyo. They burnt Osaka. They ended up burning 67 Japanese cities by dropping basically flaming gasoline on them. The other issue is that the bomb they ended up with was one that would work best if you detonated it pretty high in the air. If you detonate it high in the air, you spread the blast damage out wider, but your blast damage is also less intense. So if your target is some built-up bunker, you're not going to destroy it by blowing up the bomb in the air. If your target is a house, you don't need as much blast pressure to destroy it. So they had a bomb that they ended up with through technical decisions along the way that would be most impressive if you used it on a city. And they had many discussions about what kind of target, what's the goal of this weapon. The goal of the weapon was essentially psychological. They wanted to cause the Japanese people to say, we cannot tolerate this, we cannot win, let's surrender. One of the people involved in the discussion said that the goal was to have the Japanese basically capitulate to the power of the universe. Oh, you don't want to surrender to the United States or the Soviet Union? Well, what if we use the power of the sun to destroy you? To me, the really interesting thing is that Hiroshima was not their first choice at all for a target. The first choice that the military had was Kyoto, former capital of Japan. It was taken off the list by the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, because he thought that the city was too civilian in nature, was a cultural heritage site. Hiroshima got then bumped up to first place because it had some military bases and manufacturing in it. It had not yet been bombed. Its geography was such that it was sort of like a bowl-shaped city surrounded by hills, and that meant it would kind of intensify the effect of the weapon. So from the point of view of the United States military and the scientists who consulted from them, it was a perfectly good target. Nagasaki was only added to the target list after Kyoto was taken off of it because they wanted a backup target. The actual target for the second bombing run was a different city, Kokura. Kokura had a major arsenal in the center of it that produced weapons for the Japanese and was surrounded by workers' houses. So by their criteria, this was a great target. When they got to Kokura, though, they found that it was covered by smoke or clouds or haze. It's not clear exactly what, but they could not see it to exactly target the bomb on it. So they went to the backup target, which was Nagasaki, which was nearby. Matthew S. Waite asks, I can't help but think gun control debates mirror that of nuclear weapons proliferation. Does every country having nukes make us all safer? This is a classic question. Is the world safer if there are only a couple countries with nuclear weapons? Or would it be safer if all the countries had nuclear weapons? If there were a lot of countries with nuclear weapons, presumably they would be very hesitant to go to war with one another because the consequences would be terrible. On the other hand, if you think that the chances of either accidental nuclear war or people thinking nuclear war was winnable or terrorism, if you think the chances of those are relatively high, then more nuclear weapons in the world is a much more dangerous world because that's a world in which nuclear war is more likely to occur. It's not clear what the answer is here. Generally speaking, I'm more swayed by the arguments that it is a little bit dangerous to have lots of countries with nuclear weapons in the world. I know that's a really hot take, but I don't trust the systems or governments of these countries to be sort of perfect with regard to they're not starting a nuclear war. And if you don't think that they're going to be perfect, then it becomes very dangerous over time the more people who have nuclear weapons. Huge Bag 69 asks, enriched uranium, what is it? What is the process of enriching? How dangerous is it on its own? So uranium is an element. You can mine it out of the ground. It's a rock. You can even get it out of seawater. It's relatively abundant. By itself, if we went out and got a rock of uranium, the uranium we would find would have two types of uranium inside of it. One of them would be called uranium-238. There would be 99% of that in any uranium we pulled out of the ground. And less than 1% of it, it's like 0.7%, would be uranium-235. So these are two of the same element, but they differ in that uranium-238 has 3 more neutrons inside of it than uranium-235. So we call these different isotopes. Uranium-238 will not explode in a bomb. Uranium-235 will. So enrichment is when we take this uranium and pull out the uranium-235 almost literally atom by atom. This is a very difficult process to do because the difference between these is only 3 neutrons, which is not very much. They are chemically identical, so we have to rely on the fact that one's a little bit lighter than the other. So uranium enrichment, there's different processes for doing it. And the most famous right now is the centrifuge, where we basically are spinning around uranium in a gaseous form. And as we spin it, the centrifugal forces will cause the lighter uranium to move slightly in more one direction and the heavier slightly another. And we skim off the part that would have the lighter. And we have to run it through another centrifuge to skim off a little more, and then another to skim off a little more. And so we're taking advantage of little tiny statistical differences in how heavy they are. And we do this for thousands of centrifuges, and you will eventually end up with more and more uranium-235. When we want uranium for fuel in a nuclear power plant, we tend to enrich it up to about 3% uranium-235. When we want it for a bomb, we want it to be much higher than that. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima was about 80% uranium-235. In the United States now, the standard amount in a weapon, if we use enriched uranium, is around 93% enriched uranium. The fourth resident asks, wait, but Einstein was not a part of the Manhattan Project, so how or why did they get his help during it? Einstein's role in the atomic bomb was, at the very beginning, he wrote a letter to President Roosevelt saying, hey, we have learned how to split atoms. Germany might be working on this. Maybe somebody in the United States government should be looking at this. And that's more or less his role in the whole Manhattan Project. Why didn't they use him? They actually did consider using him, and they concluded two things. One, Einstein at this point is pretty old. He's not your cutting-edge scientist. The kind of science he does is not actually that useful for making an atomic bomb. Yes, equals mc squared sort of explains in a way where the energy comes from in an atomic bomb. It does not tell you how to make one. It doesn't tell you how to make a factory and design the things and the parts. You don't need somebody like Einstein to do that. The other thing is that Einstein was considered politically radical. He supported really out there ideas like civil rights. And that, at that time, meant that he was considered to be politically questionable by some people in the US government. And so if he is the kind of person who, to be fair, might have strong ideas about how atomic bombs ought to be used and has a lot of fame and is the kind of person that presidents would listen to, maybe you don't want him to be in the project if your goal is to just sort of get the thing done. Coastal Buckeye asks, is there still a radiation field in Hiroshima or Nagasaki? Great question. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had atomic bombs dropped on them in World War II. Here's Hiroshima. This is not far from Ground Zero. You can see this building, the very famous atomic bomb dome. Ground Zero is very close to that. These weapons were detonated very high above the city. If you look at pictures of these bombs, this is a mock-up of the kind of bomb dropped in Hiroshima. This is one for Nagasaki. You can see they've got this equipment on them, weird little wires. These are fuses that detect how high above the ground the bomb is, and they were set to detonate at the height that the scientists had calculated would maximize the blast effect of the weapon. You can think of the blast as going sort of as a sphere out from the explosion. And if it's really close to the ground, a lot of that is going to be going sort of sideways, and it's going to be running into buildings, and they're going to be absorbing the energy and also reducing it as a consequence. If you detonate it in the air, you're sort of going down with the blast force, and it's going to be much wider area. So it was detonated high in the air. The consequence of that is the people at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they got a blast of immediate radiation. It's like almost like a light switch turning on and off. You wouldn't be able to see it, but imagine it's just like a quick exposure, almost like X-rays or something like that. And that was very bad for the people who were in the range at which that would occur. But it's a short, immediate effect. It's sort of almost like a one-time exposure. The thing that makes nuclear weapons so contaminating is the nuclear fallout. These are the split atoms from the weapon. And these are in the mushroom cloud. And one interesting thing you can actually see in some of these pictures. So this is a picture of Nagasaki's mushroom cloud taken from someone on one of the airplanes that was involved in the bombing of Nagasaki. And if you look closely, you can see the cloud is actually two different parts. You have this top part, the head, and then you have this dark stem underneath it, and you can actually see that they don't connect. This is an artifact of the weapon being detonated higher up. This cloud contains the most radioactive residues from the bomb. This is mostly created by fire and debris and dust that is being pulled up by the negative pressure of this cloud moving upwards, and it is not that radioactive. Now, if this bomb had been detonated on the ground, these two parts would be mixed together. And if that happens, then the radioactive bits attach themselves to the dirt and then fall out of the cloud relatively quickly because the dirt is pretty heavy, relatively speaking. If it doesn't happen, this part stays relatively light and it'll blow on with the wind. And as it blows, it'll take a while for it to start to fall out of the cloud. And what that gets you is two things. One, the most radioactive stuff with short half-lives, they get to sort of burn out before they fall down. But this cloud, because it has time to spread, it means that it's diluting. So more area gets some radioactive bits, but they get less like per square meter, per square foot. So the amount of radiation is diffused in a way that doesn't actually make it a contamination hazard. So the long and short of it is, because they're detonated at high altitude, they did not really get a lot of nuclear fallout. Today, they are not radioactive in any significant way. If the bombs had been detonated on the ground, it would be a different story. XJSSCX on Reddit asks, what actually happens to someone in an atomic bomb explosion? The first thing, if you saw a nuclear weapon go off, one, the brightness of it. It's very bright. With that brightness comes this flash of radiation. So if you are close enough to an atomic bomb, you will instantly get a lot of radioactive particles, gamma rays, beta particles, things like this, going through your body. For the Hiroshima bomb, the radius from the detonation point where you get a fatal amount of radiation is about 3/4 of a mile. If you're in that zone, you're probably dead no matter what happens next. If you're a little out of that zone, you might get some radiation. That is probably not your biggest concern for most nuclear weapons, but it's not the best, right? The next thing that you would experience is heat. The surface of the fireball is hotter than the sun, briefly. If you're in direct line of sight with this, it's sort of like if the sun was suddenly a lot closer to you than it is right now. If you're really close to the fireball, you could be literally vaporized, as people say. Most of the people at Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not vaporized or melted or anything, but they were severely burned. You can get really bad burns. The next effect, that fireball, in that first split second of it going off, is sort of superheating the air around it. And what's going to happen then is it's going to be moving outward. This is the shock wave, the blast wave. And as it goes out, it's this sort of wave of pressure that's going to intersect with the ground and move along it and push. And the more it goes, the weaker it goes. But this is powerful enough at different distances to do a lot of damage. So at Hiroshima, if you were about 300 meters from ground zero, that would be enough blast pressure, about 20 pounds per square inch, to destroy almost any building that is standing. Any buildings that are still remaining at Hiroshima, like the famous atomic bomb dome, are gutted. Like nobody's doing well who was inside this building. They're all dead. If you go out a little further, if you were about 1.7 kilometers from ground zero at Hiroshima, that's the radius at which there's enough to definitely destroy light structures, so houses, things like that. You go out further to maybe about 2.8 miles, and now the blast wave is weak enough that the most it's doing is sort of breaking windows. That's still not great. If you're standing at a window as this thing comes to you, it's going to break all the glass and push it into you, and now you've been injured by a window. So depending on where you are, there's different effects that can happen. Strandford asks on Reddit, for how long do I stay in a fallout shelter after a nuclear war? The amount of time you need to stay in there depends on how radioactive the fallout is. Now, a lot of people think of fallout shelters like the game or show Fallout, and they think we're going to stay in there for 100 years or something like that. That is not what they are built to do. They are built to basically accommodate people to maybe stay in there for at most 2 weeks, maybe even less. You might recognize these signs. These are from the 1960s program to identify places that could be used as fallout shelters. A fallout shelter is not meant to protect you from a nuclear weapon that drops on you. What it's meant to do is be a place that puts mass, so concrete or dirt, ideally, in between you and the outside world, so that if radioactive particles fall on top of you, there is something in between you and them to cut the amount of radiation. So you can think of it when you go to the dentist and they take an X-ray and they put one of these heavy lead aprons on you. It's sort of like a building equivalent of that lead apron. Max65 asks, how dangerous is Chernobyl today? There are people who visit Chernobyl or did before the Ukraine-Russia war. There are people who work at Chernobyl still today, and they have means of checking how much radiation they pick up. There are tools called dosimeters. This is one from the Cold War. It basically tracks how much radiation you get. This one works by looking through it at a light, and a little wire moves as it absorbs radiation. And the workers on these kinds of places are making sure that the amount of radiation they pick up is within what we consider to be the safe amounts. You probably wouldn't want to live in Chernobyl, though. There are some people who have been living there, people who used to live there that eventually went back. And they've said, you know what, I just want to live in my own home. I don't care if it's contaminated. Are they at risk? Well, a little, but if they're 70 years old and living at Chernobyl increases their cancer risk by, say, 5%, they're probably going to die of something else anyway, because it takes a long time for those kinds of cancers to develop. If we talk about what if 10,000 people lived there and the cancer risk goes up by 5%, you're going to start seeing that as 5% more cancers in this community than you would already have. Austin's Burner asks, how TF does radiation work? How does a place be radioactive? How does someone die from radiation poisoning? You can think of it as little particles. That's basically what the word radiation means. It means little things spitting out. And there's lots of different kinds of radiation. The kind that people are usually talking about is called ionizing radiation. And that means radiation of types and energies that are capable of knocking electrons off of other atoms and molecules. The problem is that if you're made out of cells, especially if you have DNA, ionizing things, that changes their chemistry. And if you were a rock, who would care? But if you're a biological system, that means you're like shooting little bullets into cells, which can kill them, which is fine. You have a lot of cells, or it can, in some rare cases, change the DNA in a way that turns it into a cancerous cell. Radiation poisoning is when you get so much radiation that the number of cells you're killing becomes actually significant. So radioactive contamination is when a place has radioactive stuff that is sending out the radiation. So I have a Geiger counter here. A Geiger counter is a tool for detecting radioactivity. So what it has in it is a sensor that can tell when a radioactive particle has gone across it. And whenever it does this, you're hearing this little click happening. Why does it click? Because we hooked it to a speaker and we want to be able to hear it. Now, I could have a radioactive substance. This is trinitite, the glass from the first nuclear test. This is something that contains trace amounts of plutonium and uranium and long-lived fission products. And if I put the sensor over it, you can hear that the clicking increases by a bit. The air right above this radioactive material is getting about twice as much radioactivity as the normal air around here. That's not that much. If this was something actually dangerous, it would be getting a lot more, 100 times more. But this is the sort of tool that lets you measure when these radioactive particles are being emitted from this radioactive substance. Glittering Weakness 88 on Reddit asks, what is the theoretical upper power limit of a nuke we can produce currently? If you wanted to, you can make essentially an unlimited power nuclear weapon. A thermonuclear weapon basically works by having one nuclear weapon act as sort of the detonator for another nuclear weapon. And if you wanted to, you could make that weapon be the detonator for another nuclear weapon and that detonator for another nuclear weapon. The largest nuclear weapon ever made was the Soviet Tsar Bomba. It was tested in 1961 as a 50 megaton sized weapon, so 50 million tons of TNT, and that was at half its power. It was deliberately scaled back by half to prevent contamination. By comparison, the Hiroshima bomb is 15,000 tons of TNT. So this is a weapon thousands of times more powerful than the first atomic bombs. The United States could have done that. They actually looked into doing that kind of thing in the Cold War and decided not to. So the largest weapon that I know of that was ever taken seriously by weapons scientists in the United States was called the sundial. It was never built. They didn't get that far in researching it, but it was a weapon that was 10,000 megatons of TNT. Why did the United States not do this? Why did even the Soviet Union not really do this? The Tsar Bomba was sort of a stunt more than a practical weapon. The answer is, one, you don't get that much from it. Because of the way nuclear weapons work, because they're basically a sphere expanding in the air. Think of it as a balloon that you're like pumping air into. What we care about for the damage is the amount of the balloon that's going to touch the ground. A lot of that balloon is not going to touch the ground. And as we're putting energy into it, the part that's touching the ground, it's not increasing as a linear function. It's increasing as what's called a cubic root. The takeaway is, if we wanted to double the damage of a weapon, we typically have to increase the size of the weapon by around 8 times. The real killer, though, is to make them bigger, we do more or less have to linearly increase the weight and size of the weapon. So the Tsar Bomba is a powerful weapon, but it's the size of a school bus. That weapon could not fit inside the airplane that carried it and had to sort of sit underneath underneath it like a big egg. If you're another country and you see a plane coming towards you with a big egg attached to it, you're going to really work hard to shoot that down. That is not convenient. If you're talking about weapons that are the size of the sundial, 10,000 megatons, that's a weapon that's probably the size of the space shuttle. That's not easy to use. That's not easy to deploy. That's going to be also really expensive, as an aside. Trends in nuclear weapons design didn't go in that area. What they did was they went for more compact weapons, so you can put 10 of them onto one missile and then target 10 targets with one missile. It's a weapon the size of a large trash can, but it's 30 times more explosive than Hiroshima. That's peak weapons design, not just more bang. Perfect Football 2616 on Reddit asks, did the tactic of duck and cover provide any protection from an actual nuclear strike? Duck and cover was a public education program put out by the United States government, and it was particularly aimed at school children. And you'll see pictures of children hiding under their desk from this period. There was a short film created with a turtle cartoon mascot, Bert the Turtle, trying to talk to students about nuclear war. And of course, a lot of it looks pretty sketchy. There are lots of people who lived through this who said, that was the moment I realized adults did not know what they were doing if they thought this desk was going to protect me from an atomic bomb. They are not saying that if an atomic bomb lands on your school, your desk is going to keep you safe. What they are doing with this policy is saying, there's going to be an area where the bomb goes off where you just have no hope. I'm sorry. They don't say this in the movie because it's aimed at children. They don't even say this at things aimed at adults because the United States government has a very hard time admitting that people are going to die in large numbers if nuclear weapons go off, even though it is self-evidently true. There's also a zone much further out where you're far enough away that you'll say, what was that? Oh my gosh, what's going on? You are not going to be affected by the weapon, right? You're going to learn from the news. So in between is a pretty small zone where you have a chance of surviving if you do the right thing. Duck and cover is for that zone. And it's for an area where the blast pressure is going to be enough that it is going to be sort of like an earthquake. They're worried about the ceiling collapsing. They're worried about windows breaking. They're worried that if you have exposed skin, you might get burned. And so the tactic is get down, cover up your most vulnerable parts, and you can increase your chance of survival a little bit that way. The Mute Newt on Reddit, great name. How close did Nazi Germany actually get to developing an atomic weapon? Nazi Germany did not get close to making an atomic bomb. At the end of World War II, they were almost to the place that the United States was in 1942. So they almost had a prototype nuclear reactor, not an atomic bomb. Why not? Because they weren't trying to make an atomic bomb. I know it's a hot take because we like to talk about the race for the atomic bomb. The Americans feared they were working on an atomic bomb, but the Germans had actually decided they were going to have a pretty small research program for nuclear reactors, maybe in the future making atomic bombs. But they concluded in 1942 that it would take a lot of work from a lot of their scientists to try and make an atomic bomb that could be useful for World War II. And in 1942, they thought they were going to win the war, so they didn't think they needed an atomic bomb. They thought that making an atomic bomb would be very hard, and they were correct on that. And as a result, they thought nobody else was going to make one either. So this is a problem for after the war. Well, that's it. That's all the questions. I hope you learned something. I hope you don't make an atomic bomb. Until next time.